Y'all are still good. I like it. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Ecclesiastes chapter 6. As we continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes, I think that a little recap is in order. We're about halfway through the book at this point, and almost halfway through Solomon's arguments for why life is really worth living after all. In Ecclesiastes chapter 6, we look at the last part of what he talks about wealth not being futile. If you remember, in chapters 1 and 2, he talked about how wealth is futile, along with other things like how life was monotonous, wisdom is vain, and how death is certain. And he used those reasons in chapters 1 and 2 to say that life isn't worth living. But if you remember, he looked at it from the attitude, from the perspective of being under the sun. And we said that means that he was looking at it from a secular point of view. In the Hebrew thought, God was over the sun. And so to look at something from under the sun meant that it was without God in it. And he said, from what he could see, everything in life was hevel. And hevel is that word that means fog or smoke or vapor, something that clouds our vision. It doesn't mean that things in life are meaningless. It just means that what we do see in life, we can't really determine its meaning. And when we try to grasp it, as in to try to find satisfaction from it, it slips through our fingers. So anything in this world, anything under the sun, is not worthy of our satisfaction. But he does not say to not take joy in that. He says take joy because they are gifts from God. Remember, he starts adding God to the equation starting in chapter 3. And he says these things are gifts from God. Wealth, our earthly possessions, the things we can put value in, the things that have worldly value, are not futile. Futile meaning empty or pointless. They are not these things, but we make them these things when we treat them wrong. In chapter 5, started this argumentation. He says, when we rob God, rob the Lord of what he is due, our whole devotion, sincere and honest prayers, true sacrifice, those are things that God is due. When we rob him of that, then what we see as wealth in this life becomes futile. And then he looked at when we rob others of what's due them, respect and justice, mercy. Those things, when we rob people of those things, then what we do have in our life seems futile in comparison. And then finally, he says we rob ourselves when we treat wealth the way it's not supposed to be treated. And there are two ways that we do that. We misuse our wealth in our employment of it, and we misuse our wealth in our enjoyment of it. The end of chapter 5 talked about how we misuse our wealth through the employment of it, how we use wealth in wrong ways, and how we view wealth in wrong ways. Like we may look at wealth and say it brings satisfaction, or it brings security, or it answers life's problems. And we saw that that's not the case. That's not the case. And so we rob ourselves of the true meaning of the wealth we have and the enjoyment therein when we say this is what brings satisfaction or this is what brings security. And then we go back to what Solomon said wealth was in chapters 1 and 2, where he said, no, that's just futility, because ultimately it doesn't bring that. And the reason Solomon says that is because he was the wealthiest man in the world at the time. He had all the wealth you can imagine and more. And more. With all that wealth, he would have known what it would have been like to have been able to use it for whatever he wanted. Provide security for himself, bring satisfaction, but yet it did not. And so he is able to say that it is futile when we misuse it. Now, chapter 6 deals with the second part of that. The entire chapter, all 12 verses, deal with the second part of that, saying we misuse wealth by misenjoying it. We misemploy it, and we can misenjoy it. But to really get the context of chapter 6 before we go into it, we need to look at the end of chapter 5 again. Because we got to remember that this and the rest of the Bible, they weren't written with chapter breaks or verses. Those were added in later. for organization purposes. But the end of chapter 5 really gives the context of chapter 6. So let's look at verse 18 of chapter 5 and going forward. Here's what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor in which he toils under the sun all the days of his life, which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joys of his heart. He says we can enjoy our wealth because it is the gift of God. We can enjoy our wealth because not only did God give it, but God prospers us through it. We have to give God the glory for it, though. We have to use it in a way that honors God, honors the one who gave it to us. That's how we can truly enjoy our wealth, is when we recognize that God is the one who gives it, but also the one who commands us to use it wisely. That leads into chapter 6. Straight into chapter 6, we see a few ways we can misuse or misenjoy our wealth. And again, we're not just talking about money. We're talking about earthly possessions. Things we might place value in or might have value in this world. In verses 18 through 20 of chapter 5, he said things that are under the sun. Now he's saying things that are apart from God's specific things that God has given us that are earthly things to enjoy. First one is we can have riches without enjoyment. Let's look at verses 1 through 6. There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. Yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, or hevel, and it is an evil affliction. If a man begets 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, or indeed he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better than he is. For it comes in vanity and departs in darkness, and its name is covered with darkness. Though it has not seen the sun or known anything, this has more rest than that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice, but has not seen goodness, do not all go to one place. Pay attention to what Solomon's saying here. He's saying that there could be a person who has all the wealth they wanted in the world, and yet it's impossible to enjoy it. Now, he's not saying that is always what happens. You can have wealth and enjoy it, but you got to pay attention to Solomon's point to get that. He says you can be the kind of person who has all the wealth and still not enjoy it. You always have to look back at the end of chapter 5 to recognize why we can't enjoy it, because it is the gift of God. But this person he has all the wealth and foreigners consume it, or he might waste it, or he might use it in things that ruin him. Or he has to leave it to someone else after he dies, people who didn't work for it. He says a stillborn baby is better than this person because they have never had to experience the struggle, never had to experience the heartache, the hurt in gaining that much wealth, and then still being disappointed and not being able to enjoy it. This is the kind of person who has not given his wealth to God, who has not dedicated his earthly possessions to the Lord, who has not placed value in things of heaven instead of things of earth, as Jesus would talk about in the Sermon on the Mount. Wealth without enjoyment, he says, is hevel. He says, I don't even understand. I can't even get the point of why people have so much wealth and then choose not to enjoy it. Choose not to enjoy it in a way that's actually fulfilling, a way that honors God. He says this man is not fulfilled or satisfied in the goodness, in goodness. And the next thing is that we can have labor without satisfaction. Look at verses 7 through 9. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? What does the poor man have? Who knows how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. Look at verse 7. All the labor of a man is for his mouth. It's for his own enjoyment, for his own growth. Physically, that is. The mouth meaning to eat. That's why people work, is to put food on the table. And yet the soul is not satisfied. He says when we put all our value in our job, which is something else that can be considered wealth, our soul is not satisfied. Our soul, even though our body might be satisfied through what we can produce because of our job, our soul is not. That does not get us any closer to God or in a relationship. That's why you have to go back to the end of chapter 5 and look at what does provide that. It is understanding that the wealth, the job in this instance, is a gift from God, used to be glorifying God. Used to glorify God. And the person who works without satisfaction enjoys the wealth given to him. He doesn't enjoy it in the right way. Then finally, there's verses 10 through 12. Questions without answers. So the first one was riches without enjoyment. And then we had labor without satisfaction. Now we have questions without answers. Verses 10 through 12. Whatever one is, he has been named already. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? What will happen in this life after him? We have all these questions sometimes, these questions that can't be answered in this life. And Solomon's not saying that every question can be answered. In fact, he's saying the opposite. He's saying because there are some questions that can't be answered, we run ourselves crazy trying to find answers to these questions to the point of making speculation reality. Speculation never deserves to be reality. Speculation can be fun and it can be innocent as long as it stays as speculation. But reality has to also be reality. Speculation cannot become reality because your speculation might be false. So sometimes, and here's a big theological point here, sometimes the best way to answer is I don't know. Sometimes that's the best way to answer something is I don't know. Sometimes there is an answer that can be found after digging. Sometimes that question might be more obvious than we think, or the answer to that question rather. But sometimes the best answer is I don't know. And Solomon kind of gives a few questions like this within these verses. Look at these verses again. The first part of verse 10. Whatever one is, he has been named already. So here's the first question we can derive from this. Since what's going to be is what's going to be, why bother to make decisions? This is a big theological, not just theological question, but big life question from Solomon, who, remember, he is speaking to a group of people. That's where the word Ecclesiastes comes from. He's having a debate with himself in front of a group of people, and he's asking, or he gives these thoughts where people will naturally ask this. If everything's going to be the way it's going to be, why make decisions? Point you back to the last part of chapter 5. All we have has been given to us by God. We can make decisions to glorify God, and so we don't enjoy what we have. Or another question, the second part of verse 10. For it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. The second part of the second question from verse 10 is, why disagree with God? We can't oppose him and win, can we? So why do we ever disagree with God? Remember, at the end of this chapter, he'll say, this is still hevel. This is a fog, a smoke that we can't fully grasp the meaning of this. He says, why do we still disagree with God, we can't win up against him. Now look at verse 11. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? So he says, well, a question that could derive from this is, what do we accomplish with all these words? Does talking about things solve problems? Solve the problem? Just mere talk. Does mere talking solve problems? What can we accomplish from all these words? Since there are many things that increase vanity, increase this fog, remember this hevel in our life, why do we keep searching? The more we search, the more mysteries there seem to appear, the more questions that seem to arise. Why keep searching? Then the first part of verse 12. For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Who knows what is good for us? Who, without God, remember, can actually know what's good for us? And then the last part of verse 12. Who can tell a man what will happen to him under the sun? Does anybody know what's coming next? The next thing that's going to happen in our life? What the future holds? These are several natural questions that we ask ourselves and ask others that don't necessarily have an answer. But the hevel, this fog, can be dispelled a little bit when we go back to the very first or last part of chapter 5. Remember, this entire section, chapters 5 and 6, are talking about the wealth and why wealth is not actually futile. We're the ones that make it futile. But when we give God what is due him, which is our lives, our very existence, our devotion, these questions don't seem as important. We choose because we want to glorify God. God is holding time, so it doesn't matter what happens next. I will not misemploy my wealth because I'm trying to glorify God. I will not misenjoy my wealth because I enjoy it to the extent of knowing that God is the one who gives it, and God can also be the one who takes it away. I look at it as a pure gift for me to glorify him with. So the first argument was answered. Life is not monotonous. Chapters 3 and 4. Life is not monotonous. There's too much that God controls in life for life to ever be boring and monotonous. And now the second argument is answered. Wealth is not futile. We're the ones that make it that way. It's not futile when we give God the glory for it, when we remember our Creator because of it. So that's two of his arguments answered. Remember, chapters 1 and 2 dealt with the four arguments to say life was not worth living. Two of these have been refuted. He has two more. Starting in chapter 7, he starts with the argument of, is wisdom actually vain? Is there actually vanity in wisdom? Maybe you're here tonight and you've been somebody who has made wealth your main goal in life. You have not enjoyed wealth or employed wealth in the right way. And by wealth, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about the things that God has given you. Your very life is wealth. The very breath you take, it's wealth. We can misenjoy it and misemploy it. We can rob ourselves of that. Maybe you're somebody who has accepted God's call, but has forgotten what it means to give God the glory for these things, to live for God and make sure that he is the one who gets the praise and the worship, and not you. If you're somebody who is out of the church, on the outside of salvation, that can change tonight. All it requires is hearing the gospel, that Jesus came to this earth, died for us, and rose again on the third day. When believing that gospel and repenting of our sins and confessing that he is the Son of God, and then being baptized for the remission of sins in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, then raising again to walk in newness of life, to give God the glory for the things he has given us. And when we give God the glory, and God is glorified in every action and everything we own, he will be truly pleased. Whatever your need is tonight, please come as together we stand and sing.